Blanket tariff of 25% on steel and aluminium imports to the US has come into effect for all of America's trading partners with no exceptions or exemptions.
In a stunning escalation that has sent shockwaves through global markets, Europe has just pulled the trigger on a brutal economic counterstrike, one that is aimed squarely at the heart of the automobile industry in the United States. For a number of months, the administration of President Trump has been increasing trade tensions by imposing aggressive tariffs with the intention of protecting manufacturing in the United States and reducing trade deficits. However, Europe has now responded in a manner that is significantly beyond what was anticipated. They have launched a retaliatory strike that is strategically calculated to cause maximum damage and potentially completely cripple the automotive industry in the United States. The most important factor in this crisis is President Trump's decision to impose a steep tariff of 25% on automobile imports from Europe. This decision was made with the intention of compelling European automakers to either manufacture their products in the United States or pay a punishing price. This controversial decision was met with immediate outrage across the globe, drawing harsh condemnation from influential European leaders such as Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, who vowed to take swift and ruthless retaliation against those responsible for the decision. People in the United States of America, including politicians, business executives, and economists, are in a state of disbelief due to the intensity and precision of Europe's response. Through the use of surgical precision, Europe has strategically imposed tariffs with the intention of not only directly affecting American automobile manufacturers, but also undermining politically significant industries in the United States, ranging from agriculture to technology. The very future of the nation's automobile industry, and by extension, the economic security of a great number of American families, is in jeopardy as the news continues to reverberate throughout the factories and boardrooms of corporations in the United States. At this time, supply chains are being disrupted, factories are facing the possibility of shutting down, and thousands of workers in the United States are in danger of losing their jobs. Industry giants such as Ford, General Motors, and Tesla are struggling to deal with the unprecedented fallout. The aggressive counterstrike that Europe has launched is not simply an economic retaliation. Rather, it is a message that the actions of the United States have consequences, and those consequences have arrived with devastating influence. Everyone is now wondering whether or not the United States automobile industry will be able to withstand the crippling blow that Europe has dealt. The moment that everything began was when President Donald Trump made a shocking announcement that shook the foundations of markets all over the world. With the intention of redressing what he perceived to be an unfair trade imbalance, President Trump announced that the United States would impose a massive tariff of 25% on automobile imports from Europe. A chain reaction was immediately triggered across the Atlantic Ocean as a result of the news, which was not only audacious, but also explosive. Trump argued that Europe had been taking advantage of the economy of the United States for decades, flooding American streets with their luxurious vehicles while restricting access for American manufacturers in their own markets. He saw this as more than just a matter of economics. Rather, it was a struggle for the dignity, pride, and economic autonomy of the United States. Critics, on the other hand, argued that his approach was reckless and warned that such aggressive protectionism would spark retaliation and escalate tensions to dangerous heights. And raise the stakes it did. European leaders who were taken aback by the gravity of Trump's action did not waste any time in submitting their responses. A chilling statement was delivered by Ursula von der Leyen, the powerful president of the European Commission. This statement immediately sent shockwaves through financial markets all over the world. She cautioned that Europe would not merely retaliate, rather, it would respond strategically, directly targeting industries that are essential to Trump's political support base. The transatlantic relationship descended into chaos almost immediately after it was established. The industries that European officials targeted were carefully chosen, with a particular emphasis placed on politically influential states located in the center of the United States. Unexpectedly, agricultural exports, which had already been vulnerable due to previous trade wars, were once again put in jeopardy. There was a high-stakes game that neither side could afford to lose, and the products that were used as pawns in the game included everything from soybeans and beef to industrial equipment. What started out as a protectionist policy with the intention of assisting American workers quickly morphed into something much more significant, an economic showdown that threatened to bring entire industries to their knees. As the United States of America prepared itself for Europe's calculated retaliation, analysts speculated with trepidation about the possibility of job losses, rising costs, and disruptions to supply chains among other potential outcomes. Nevertheless, nobody was completely ready for the true magnitude of the next move that Europe would make. An atmosphere of uncertainty and fear was created as a result of the news that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, had become involved in investigations of American manufacturing. This news caused tensions to escalate further. This was not a straightforward disagreement over trade, as became immediately apparent to everyone who was watching. It was the beginning of something much larger, something much darker, and it had the potential to revolutionize the economic future of the United States of America for all time. The European Union's reaction to the sanctions imposed by President Trump in the form of tariffs was prompt, strategic, and absolutely devastating. Ursula von der Leyen, the unflinching and powerful leader of Europe, did not waste any time in launching a ruthless counterstrike, especially one that would intentionally hit the United States of America, where it would hurt the most. Over the course of a few days, the European Union revealed a highly strategic list of tariffs that were aimed at important industries in the United States. Europe chose to focus on particular states and industries, which are directly connected to Trump's voter base, rather than taking a broad and reckless approach to the situation. Suddenly, agricultural products from states in the Midwest, such as soybeans from Iowa and pork from Ohio, were subjected to import taxes that threatened to cripple their production. Additionally, motorcycles made in Wisconsin and bourbon from Kentucky were among the items that were under attack. It was a strategic move with the goal of generating the greatest possible amount of political pressure, with the intention of making the president's own supporters experience the economic pain first. However, that was not the end of Europe's vengeance. In a short amount of time, European trade officials, with the support of influential industrial leaders, tightened restrictions on automobiles and automotive parts manufactured in the United States. Quickly, the once thriving automobile industry in the United States felt the pressure. Overnight, supply chains were thrown into disarray as a result of the sudden inability of American manufacturers to acquire essential components made in Europe. These components included sophisticated electronic components for automobiles, specialized steel, and intricate engine parts. Companies such as Ford, General Motors, and Tesla issued an immediate warning that these measures could have devastating consequences, including production slowdowns, plant closures, and job losses that would affect thousands of families in the United States. Automakers in the United States, which were already struggling under the weight of economic uncertainty, were now confronted with a harsh reality. Europe's counterattack threatened their very existence. Nevertheless, the counterattack did not merely target automobiles. Through the utilization of their enormous purchasing power, European nations were able to cancel contracts for industrial machinery, tractors, and equipment that was manufactured in the United States. Companies such as John Deere and Caterpillar suddenly found themselves in a position of extreme financial strain, which threatened to force them to close factories located throughout the American Midwest. The retaliation that Europe took, however, did not end there. The continent changed its massive energy import contracts away from American providers and instead turned to alternative suppliers in Qatar, Australia, and even China. This was done in a strategic manner. The American energy giants, who were accustomed to dominating the natural gas markets in Europe, were left in a state of perplexity when their contracts worth billions of dollars vanished overnight. The message was unmistakable. Europe's brutal counterattack was not simply about economic fairness. Rather, it was a calculated and deliberate strike meant to teach the United States of America a painful lesson. It was made abundantly clear by Ursula von der Leyen in a statement that was uncompromising. Europe will not be bullied. If the United States wishes to threaten our economic stability, we will respond in kind, with measures designed to maximize impact. As factories in the United States started laying off workers and farmers in the Midwest saw their livelihoods disappear almost instantly, the devastating reality began to set in. Europe's brutal counterattack had the potential to cause long-term, catastrophic damage to the economy of the United States. The United States of America watched in disbelief as businesses that had previously flourished struggled to survive as a result of Europe's harsh tariffs. As concerns about a protracted trade war spread, the stock market in the United States reacted with panic and experienced a sharp decline. Economists started sounding the alarm that what had begun as a political maneuver by Trump appeared to be rapidly escalating into an economic crisis that had implications for the entire world. The ruthless counterattack that Europe had carried out had achieved exactly what it had intended to do. It had shaken the foundations of the United States of America, and no one, not even Trump, could ignore the devastating consequences any longer. Similar to an economic earthquake, the European counterstrike struck the automotive industry in the United States of America. It was swift, severe, and completely unrelenting. Automakers in the United States, who had previously been self-assured about their dominance on a global scale, were now confronted with a terrifying new reality. Their very existence was in jeopardy. Almost overnight, factories that had been operating continuously for decades came to a complete halt, and the assembly lines that had been thriving for decades became eerily quiet. Industry giants such as Ford and General Motors, which were already struggling with rising material costs, were now forced to face the reality of crippling European tariffs on essential automotive components. These tariffs applied to components such as precision transmissions, advanced engine modules, and sophisticated electronics. Tesla, the electric car darling of the United States, had its ambitious plans to dominate the global electric vehicle market suddenly derailed by Europe's calculated strikes on battery components and rare earth metals. This forced Tesla to make painful reassessments of its future production goals. The global supply chain that had been painstakingly constructed over the course of decades was severely disrupted by Europe, and experts warned that the automobile manufacturers in the United States were extremely dependent on it. Nearly every automobile manufactured in the United States contained electronic components, specialty metals, or advanced semiconductor chips that were sourced from Europe. The prices of these essential components skyrocketed overnight, making it economically impossible to manufacture entire vehicle lines without resorting to alternative methods. A large number of jobs were put in jeopardy as a result of the impact, which quickly spread throughout the supply chain. Workers in factories in Detroit, steel plants in the Midwest, and assembly lines in the South were taken aback when employees were informed of reduced hours, furloughs, and even permanent layoffs due to the economic downturn. If nothing is done to change the situation, analysts in the industry have begun issuing urgent warnings that the once thriving automobile industry in the United States could lose tens of thousands of jobs in a matter of months. During the same time period, automobile dealerships all over the country were thrown directly into chaos. Due to the diminishing supply of vehicles and the emptying of showrooms, prices skyrocketed. Families who had previously intended to purchase new automobiles watched helplessly as prices skyrocketed to an extent that was out of their reach. The markets for used automobiles became absolutely chaotic as a result of panic buying and hoarding, which caused prices to rise even further, resulting in widespread public frustration. The executives of the automotive industry went to great lengths to find solutions, making direct appeals to the government in Washington and pleading with policymakers to de-escalate the trade war before it completely spiraled out of control. Mary Barra, the chief executive officer of General Motors, issued a public warning that prolonged tariffs would result in the permanent shutdown of factories and the mass layoff of employees. During a public statement, Elon Musk expressed concern that the ongoing crisis may irreversibly damage Tesla's ambitious plans for the global market. Economists expressed concern that the damage would not be limited to automobile industries. The devastating economic impact would be felt across the entire country, affecting everything from retail sales and consumer confidence to trucking and logistics. Companies of significant size that are dependent on vehicle fleets, such as Amazon, UPS, and FedEx, quickly realized that their operating costs would skyrocket, which forced them to make challenging decisions regarding employment, pricing, and expansion strategies. In terms of politics, the repercussions were just as severe. As states in the Midwest, which have traditionally been supportive of President Trump's economic agenda, were forced to bear the brunt of job losses and economic disruption, anger and anxiety turned towards the federal government in Washington. Politicians from the states that were hit the hardest by the tariffs were now facing a backlash from constituents that had never been seen before, making demands for action and accountability. There was a gloomy reality that stood at the center of this chaos. The strategic tariffs that Europe implemented were not only economic, they were also political. Europe targeted Trump's political base in an effort to exert maximum pressure for policy reversal. This was accomplished by striking at critical components that are essential to the manufacturing of automobiles in the United States. A number of analysts referred to it as a ruthless economic chess move with the intention of compelling American policymakers to return to the negotiating table or risk experiencing long-term political and economic repercussions. While this was going on, European automobile manufacturers had started rapidly shifting their focus, starting to source alternative markets in Asia and Africa, and diversifying their supply chains away from their dependence on American markets. The strategy was not only intended to punish the United States economically, but it was also designed to redefine the global power dynamics in the automotive industry. It was a bold and ruthless strategy. As the United States automobile industry struggled under the crushing counterstrike of Europe, the American people were left wondering how everything had come to such a rapid and catastrophic end. Did this really have anything to do with tariffs and trade, or was it a more fundamental geopolitical conflict that threatened the economic security, prosperity, and pride of the United States of America? The catastrophic effects of Europe's targeted counterattack were not confined to the automotive sector alone. Rather, they were felt throughout the entire economy. As if dominoes were falling one by one, entire communities across the heartland of the United States of America started experiencing severe economic repercussions, with each consequence being more profound and devastating than the one that came before it. Farmers were the first and hardest to feel the impact, as they were already reeling from previous trade tensions and volatile market conditions. The new tariffs imposed by Europe targeted agricultural products such as soybeans, corn, pork, and beef, which were commodities that were essential to the states located in the Midwest. What appeared out of nowhere was a lack of demand for the crops that American farmers had painstakingly cultivated. As a result of the increasing financial losses, harvests were left unsold, grain elevators were flooded, and livestock operations were struggling to survive. The farmers watched helplessly as their means of subsistence began to deteriorate, and the prospect of debt and bankruptcy loomed ominously on the horizon. Within a short period of time, the crisis spread beyond just farms. Companies that supply agricultural equipment, such as industry giants like John Deere and Caterpillar, discovered that demand was falling significantly as a result of farmers tightening their belts and canceling orders for tractors, harvesters, and heavy machinery. Production facilities in the states of Illinois, Iowa, Ohio, and Wisconsin began to lay off workers. A number of small towns, which had previously flourished as a result of these factories, were confronted with an uncertain economic future. In the meantime, the volume of goods that was transported across the country by shipping and logistics companies, which are essential for transporting manufactured goods and agricultural products, decreased significantly. Truck drivers, dock workers, and warehouse operators all found themselves in a precarious position when their livelihoods were suddenly threatened. Diners, motels, and petrol stations, which are small businesses located along transportation corridors, also felt the pinch, as their customer base significantly decreased over the course of the night. As the level of uncertainty increased across the country, consumer confidence started to plummet. All of a sudden, families were confronted with skyrocketing prices for items that they commonly use, such as groceries, automobiles, and electronic devices. Household budgets became extremely difficult to manage as a result of the rapid acceleration of inflation, which was caused by disruptions in supply chains and increased costs of imports. They were forced to make difficult decisions, such as delaying the purchase of automobiles, lowering their spending on food, or reducing their expenditures on healthcare and education. Shortly after, political repercussions became apparent. There was an initial promise made by President Trump to his supporters that his aggressive tariffs would protect jobs in the United States and restore prosperity to communities that had been forgotten. As an alternative, voters were now confronted with the loss of jobs, rising costs, and the collapse of local economies, which caused them to direct their anger and frustration towards Washington. Even supporters who had been traditionally loyal started to question whether or not the aggressive trade war strategy was actually in their best interest. In addition to the damage done to the economy, the social impacts became further and further apparent. Higher rates of stress-related illnesses, increased depression, and a sense of hopelessness were reported in communities that were experiencing widespread layoffs and economic turmoil. During a time when families were experiencing unprecedented levels of both financial and emotional strain, public health officials expressed open concern regarding the growing mental health crisis that was unfolding in the heartland of the United States. Banks and other financial institutions were put under pressure as the number of loan defaults increased. This was due to the fact that farmers and owners of small businesses were unable to fulfill their financial obligations. It was possible that the looming threat of foreclosures and bankruptcies would exacerbate the economic crisis that was affecting rural areas in the United States, potentially dragging entire regions into a downward spiral of prolonged economic hardship. It was initially intended that Europe's retaliatory tariffs would be a precise political strike. However, they had now triggered a cascading economic crisis that had extended far beyond the targets that they had intended to affect. Communities in the United States, ranging from farms to factories, truck stops to family kitchens, found themselves caught in the crossfire of a fierce international conflict. And as rage, fear, and desperation spread across the nation, people all over the United States started wondering how much the ultimate cost of this trade war would be, and who would be the next to pay for it. The aggressive response that Europe provided was not merely a reaction. Rather, it was a strike that was carefully calculated with the intention of causing the United States the greatest amount of political pain and economic disruption possible. Clearly, European leaders, led by the decisive Ursula von der Leyen, understood that targeting the political heartland of President Trump would generate enormous internal pressure, which would force the United States to reconsider its aggressive tariff policy. Europe's strategy was made abundantly clear by historical precedents. Prior to this, European leaders had strategically targeted industries that were located in states that were extremely important to Trump's political base during earlier trade disputes. The previous implementation of this strategy had resulted in the imposition of targeted tariffs on products such as Harley-Davidson motorcycles from Wisconsin, Kentucky bourbon whiskey, and Levi's jeans, all of which are symbols of American culture that deeply resonated with these supporters of Trump. It was through this action that Europe demonstrated a nuanced understanding of the political geography of the United States, crafting a response that was not only intended to retaliate economically, but also to drive political wedges within the United States. However, this time around, Europe's strategic response was even more ruthless, and it was directed squarely at the automobile industry in the United States, which is the very symbol of manufacturing pride and employment in the United States. By imposing crippling tariffs on automotive parts, Europe sent a chilling message to the United States. Any further aggression from Washington would be met with escalating severity. It is important to note that Europe's actions were not solely a form of retaliation. They were also proactive. Europe positioned itself to fill the economic void left by the United States by strategically weakening the industrial capacity of the United States. This opened the door for Europe to form new alliances and partnerships in other regions, taking advantage of opportunities in China and India, both of which are eager to expand economic ties with the European Union. Europe has made a rapid pivot towards markets in Asia and Africa, serving as a signal of its desire to reduce its dependence on goods produced in the United States. The heads of state in Europe made it abundantly clear that the actions they took were not merely symbolic or temporary measures. Instead, this counterattack was a long-term strategy with the intention of permanently reshaping the relationship between global trade and international commerce. The implications were crystal clear. Europe's intention was to demonstrate economic independence, assert geopolitical strength, and weaken the global influence of the United States of America by imposing tariffs one after the other. Not only did Europe's bold retaliation represent an immediate response to Trump's tariff aggression, but it also hinted at something much more consequential: the possibility of a realignment of the global economic order itself. European countries were already moving quickly towards reshaping their global economic relationships, moving away from Washington and towards new partnerships in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. This was in response to the escalating tensions and the rapid deterioration of diplomatic relations between Europe and the United States. In an aggressive manner, Europe started exploring new trade relationships with a particular emphasis on China. India's enormous manufacturing base and economic power were seen by Europe as crucial alternatives to relying on American markets, despite the fact that there were already rivalries and differences between the two countries. The leaders of China, perceiving an opportunity, promptly accepted these overtures and proceeded to negotiate expanded trade agreements with the intention of compensating for the decreased demand for European exports from the United States. During the process of economic realignment, energy became yet another battlefield. In the past, European nations had placed a significant amount of reliance on natural gas and petroleum products originating from the United States. However, Europe abruptly indicated a shift towards other suppliers, most notably Qatar, Australia, and even Russia. This shift occurred in a short amount of time. A pointed geopolitical shift was represented by this decision, which indicated that Europe was willing to challenge long-standing alliances and forge new strategic partnerships independent of the influence of the United States. This decision was not just one of economic significance. Meanwhile, there was a significant shift in the alliances between technological experts. European technology companies, which had previously collaborated closely with American companies, have begun aggressively pivoting towards collaboration with Asian counterparts, particularly in the production of semiconductors and the research of artificial intelligence. Considering the rapid pace of technological advancement in China, the prospect of Europe and China forming technological alliances has become not only plausible, but also strategically appealing. This poses a threat to the long-term dominance of Silicon Valley and American technology giants. Additionally, there was an expansion of Europe's trade diversification into emerging markets in South America and Africa. The previous perception of these regions was that they were primarily sources of raw materials. However, in recent years, they have come to be seen as thriving markets and strategic partners in Europe's larger effort to achieve economic independence from the United States. By making investments in infrastructure, renewable energy, and industrial partnerships across these regions, Europe aimed to not only diversify its economy, but also strategically outmaneuver the influence of the United States on the international stage. It was abundantly clear that Europe was conveying a broader message, which was that the era of economic dominance by the United States was no longer guaranteed. Rather than being merely a short-term trade conflict, this conflict had the potential to mark the beginning of a new economic order in the world. These shifting alliances could permanently undermine American manufacturing, technological innovation, and global economic influence, according to economists, who warned of the long-term consequences of the situation. The harsh reality that policymakers in Washington were confronted with was that Europe's aggressive economic pivot posed a threat not only to the economic interests of the United States, but also to its strategic global power. Experts have warned that if the trade war between the United States and Europe is not resolved, it could ultimately become a defining moment, one that fundamentally reshaped the nature of the economic landscape around the world. A chilling question hung over the United States of America as these tectonic economic shifts unfolded. Had Europe just fired the first shots in a battle for global economic supremacy? And if so, could the United States afford to lose? As the United States of America reels from Europe's devastating economic counterattack, the country is now confronted with a stark crossroads. Will this escalating crisis drive both sides towards compromise, or will it push them further into a destructive economic standoff? A number of factories have been shut down, farms have been rendered inoperable, and tens of thousands of workers are facing an uncertain future. The devastating effects are already painfully visible. Automobile manufacturers and their suppliers in the United States, which were once pillars of industrial strength, are now on the verge of collapse, with their very existence being threatened by Europe's strategic retaliation. As each day goes by, the level of political pressure continues to rise, and public outrage is reaching a boiling point. Nevertheless, the possibility of finding a solution can be found within this chaos. A prolonged economic war is not beneficial to anyone, including the United States of America, Europe, and most certainly not the workers who are caught in the crossfire. This is a consensus among analysts. A way forward could be found through negotiations. However, the question is whether or not leaders on both sides will be willing to swallow their pride and find common ground. A growing number of business leaders, politicians from states that are being impacted by the economic crisis, and millions of voters who feel they have been betrayed by the crisis are exerting increasing pressure on President Trump. Europe is aware of the dangers that come with a protracted conflict, despite the fact that it has already taken decisive action. Both parties are aware that they have reached a critical juncture. If they continue down this path, both economies run the risk of suffering irreparable damage. If they take a step back, this may allow the wounds to heal. However, the damages caused by this economic conflict may extend further than the realm of economics. Trust has been violated, alliances have been shattered, and interactions on a global scale have been irrevocably altered. It is possible that the United States automobile industry will never fully recover from the crippling counterstrike that Europe launched, and the United States' economic standing in the world may forever bear the scars of this conflict. The United States of America is currently confronted with a terrifying choice. Either engage in an economic war that has the potential to cause irreparable damage, or seek a compromise before it is too late. The world is watching with bated breath, fully aware that whatever occurs next will have a profound impact on the economy of the entire world for many generations to come. The real question that needs to be answered is whether or not this will result in a crisis, or whether or not the United States and Europe will be able to find a way to pull themselves back from the brink of disaster.